Which chair would you like? That one? Good.
This is fine. Thank you, David.
My pleasure.
Wonderful remarks, and what an inspiring commentary as we begin this weekend. Let's hear another round for David. David, you have talked about social capital. You have talked about clustering, partnerships, all of this together, and yet we live in an era of individualism, rugged individualism through technology, where we have our own cell phones, we have our own iPads, we get so self-absorbed. How do we break out of that to bring communities together to do this remarkable work that you're talking about? To do the work, if you want to go far, go together. In a technological age that is changing everything.
One of the strengths, Linda, of our country is that we have so many competing traditions, and we have this great tradition of people coming together to make it work in our country. We also have a tradition of individualism. And there's a scene in the longer version of Fixing the Future where the smartest man I know comes up on screen. Smartest man I know. Patrick Brancaccio, my dad, who's a professor. He comes on for just a flash frame for a moment. And he says, he's a professor of American literature and knows his way around American studies, and he talks. I go, Dad, my voice starts going up like an octave when I talk to my own father. Dad, we're supposed to get better each generation, but we're not sure about our grandkids. And he says, well, because first of all, this is a country, for better or for worse, that has this tradition of individualism, and it leaves us vulnerable when every generation we face a crisis. This is not the first time America has faced a crisis. And in a sense, our impulse to bury ourselves in our technology is part of that idea that we can go it alone. I did an experiment for Marketplace in which I wondered if in modern day America you could drive from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and never interact with a human because technology is so pervasive, and pretty much did it. You can check yourself into these Hyatt Place hotels that have robots as receptionists, and you can go to the grocery and self-checkout and so forth. However, there's one of the great engines of innovation in America we would call social entrepreneurship. I think we have probably a room full of social entrepreneurs here. People using their organizational skills and their drive and their entrepreneurial zeal to apply that to social problems. And they're using technology in interesting ways. We're looking at this in Northern California recently to energize younger people to connect with the wider community. Instead of it being an isolating experience that drives us apart. And there's some really interesting ways in which through technology you can connect people who've suddenly found themselves in a job where they're making more money than they ever thought to social problems that need their money and need their skills. One example of this is people were alerted through technology, a bunch of software engineers, to a technological problem that needs some fixing, and I'm guessing there are some people here who have watched this play out in their own work. Often, Linda, the first time somebody finds out that food stamps, the benefit has run out for them, for whatever reason, is they're in the grocery line with the kids, and it doesn't scan. That is not the place to find out, with a grocery cart full of stuff that you need, and with the kids. So, and often that decision made in some computer in Washington isn't right. It's an inappropriate decision. So the software engineers came together to figure out an early warning system so that if it's wrong, people can challenge it before it's a problem, but also if indeed that's the way it's going, give people a moment to plan. The technology helped that. So it gives me some hope.
That is very hopeful. So what can a community do, and where do we get started? Does it start with grassroots? Does it start with government, nonprofit, educational institutions? All of these examples seem to be people coming together with common problems and coming up with solutions. But how do you get that engine, what Don called those million engines, how do you get those engines together?
Well, I think part of it is we're in a room full of people who figured out how to do just that. and we know it's hard. And then what's maybe especially hard is you start with early energy, and people are very excited, but it's sustaining their impact in these areas. We kind of know what we want to do. We kind of know who the partners might be, but keeping it going over time is the real trick. For instance, the time banking system that I look at in the film, they come together, and there's usually a person willing to donate a year and a half of their lives to standing up the project, but they're not willing to devote the rest of their lives to standing up the project. And so that's another reason why the great theory of history doesn't help us as much. You will have heroes that may be catalysts, but then you have to grow these organizations in ways that the leadership is much more shared and diffuse. But my answer to how we get people to come together is to do what this conference is doing and what I hope the film did, which is modeling good behavior. I didn't have to look far for the examples that are in the film. I just kind of started to look. So often you could find compelling stories. And what I learned in my preparation for the afternoon session is it wasn't hard to find the projects here in South Carolina. But we have to share that information. This is a movement, this kind of economic development through partnership, through creative thinking, that doesn't have a name. What do we call it? There's the environmental movement. That has a name. But what is this? And what I've just noticed is there's a lot of people pulling in the same direction around the country. Smells like a movement to me, but it needs a little bit of branding work, in a sense.
Right. We need the brand experts. Well, there's also a movement in journalism, and I have to say, you have been on top of this movement with your documentary. And that movement is solutions journalism. For so long, we have heard about all of the problems and the really difficulties in society, and that has really been sort of the mantra of especially newspapers and investigative reporting. And now there's a movement led by a number of people, one in the New York Times, called solutions journalism. Here you are fixing the future. You did it a number of years ago. But what is the role of media in this effort of forming partnerships, or at least enlightening people about these partnerships?
It's the funniest thing, Linda. I mean, as a person who's run a newsroom, you probably run into this. It's amazing how it's an uphill pitch to talk about covering heroes and focusing on solutions. I had a crusty editor who once said to me, when I was a cub reporter, 200 planes landed safely at San Francisco International Airport. It's not news. It's not what we're talking about. It's not what we're talking about. I worked with a legendary journalist who felt, and I can see his point, I'm not arguing with him. He felt that we have a limited amount of airtime in a given week. There's a lot of bad in the world. It is our duty to be sure we're watching it. And it will always be journalism's duty to watch what's going on, because when you're not watching, they get away with it even more. However, I'm probably basically an optimist. And here's the thing. I mean, I hope, Linda and I talked about this before. I will share this analogy with you. I hope you take it in the right spirit. I always found myself, and you've been there, you're reading an obituary in the paper, and you're saying, what an inspiring person, what an incredible life. And then you say, why did the person have to die before I found out about it? So then I thought, well, what could you do maybe to profile people before they're gone? Then I thought, well, when is that? Like when they're kind of ill and ready to go? Well, wait a minute, you could do that at the point that they're starting out even. In other words, that type of story has a place in what we do. Giving airtime and column inches and digital space on websites to people who are committed to a better future is absolutely appropriate, with one exception, right, Linda? You have to engage the material in a critical fashion. You're not doing suck-up PR pieces. If there are questions to be asked, you have to ask them. An example. We covered social enterprises on the PBS show, and I got to tell you, it was a blast. I got to work with Paul Farmer, the legendary public health guy, who has done incredible work in Haiti, in Central America, and in Africa. I got to love doing those stories. But there was a move to bring microfinancing around the world, championed by a wonderful guy from the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Did he win the Nobel Peace Prize? Yeah, he did. A very important movement in which it turns out that some of the most disadvantaged people are very good credit risks, and when you lend a little bit amount of money, the record in paying it back is a very good one, and it can be used to transform people's lives. However, some big financial institutions thought this was also a very good idea and were running to places like Mexico to get into the microfinance area, and there were some benefits, but there was also an argument that it was destructive, that it was getting people on the hook, getting them in hock in a way that ultimately would be destructive. So these questions had to be asked of even good ideas. But here's the thing, when you critically engage material, it helps the audience critically engage material, and ultimately when even a good news, positive future issue is examined in a critical way, if it passes muster with the audience, they'll be much more likely to sort of accept what's going on. But it's interesting that it's taken, right, Linda, so long for us to do these stories.
So that story, I believe, is Muhammad Yunus. So that will maybe work with the Grameen Bank, but maybe it won't work everywhere. So part of the journalistic experience is showcasing the solutions, but also saying, this works here, but maybe not somewhere else. One question on the Cleveland experience that you talked about. You talked about how businesses were coming together, 3 institutions, and they were seeing that for their own interest, it was important to invest back into the community. It seems to me this is an area, this might be the low-hanging fruit, to go to businesses and say, you live, you work in this community. This is important, that we start to remove these barriers for these people, because it will help your business in the long run.
It's interesting. There's so many business leaders that get it already, but an interesting mechanism that some communities have found to raising consciousness about this is the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. What I call it in the film, it's kind of like a groovy chamber of commerce. But it's not just a coalition of business people, it's also other stakeholders in a community. And they talk about what kind of community do we want. And they point out to all the stakeholders, including the business folks, you live here too. Do you care if it's a mess? Do you care if people are employed? Of course, all the business leaders say, of course I care. I care desperately. I live someplace, I live here. And so we saw, it was Bellingham, Washington, where this became most clear to me in the film. I mentioned it in my prepared remarks. It's a really big industrial strength pizza oven company called Woodstone. And they do the ovens for California Pizza Kitchen, but they're probably, if you have a nice pizza in a chain restaurant, it's theirs. And he absolutely got a low bid from Asia to fabricate parts. But he's part of this Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And he goes, I live here. How do we create jobs? If his only question was, what's the cheapest, he would have made a certain series of decisions. But among the questions he was asking himself was, where's the cheapest place to get the following part manufactured? But also, what has the best outcome for my business? But also, what has the best outcome for my community? And that's where he rethought it. And ultimately, it was a very good business decision. He brought in technology from overseas, but he hired 40 more people he didn't have already. People who, some of them were very skilled at playing video games, and the skills transferred to running these robots. And so it became an engine of economic development, asking wider questions about how do my decisions accrue to the place where I live? And I said to him something quite edgy like, he showed up in a nice enough Volvo station wagon. But, seen better days. And I said, you're the CEO. This company's successful. How about a Lamborghini or something? And this is a guy who said, well, maybe someday, he said, but he said more important to him was living in a place that seemed more vibrant to him. It's very difficult to prove cause and effect. And we haven't talked that much about measurement and benchmarks here. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. But it's hard to prove cause and effect. But Bellingham, Washington's unemployment rate has been significantly lower than the surrounding region and the rest of the state for 10 years now. And that is when this Business Alliance for Local Living Economies has been around. So I think that people understand that they have to live somewhere.
So there are metrics showing this can work. There have been some studies that show that young people, say age 25 to 35, out of college, are looking now for places rather than jobs. They're looking for that community that has a quality of life, a diversity. How, if you were starting your trek, your career, what community would you find that has it all, that has that blend that is working well with partnerships?
And it is true, that's why, that's what young people are looking for. That's the odd thing in Northern California right now, is that the heart of Silicon Valley is towns that if you've seen on the map, Cupertino, Mountain View, near San Jose, near Stanford. But the cool people who make that all possible living in downtown San Francisco. There's been some friction there because so many people have suddenly moved to downtown San Francisco, something we've been chronicling on the air. But when you go to San Francisco and talk to local politicians about the effect of attracting some of these wonderful people with great ideas to their community, but it having disruptive effects, one of the cool things that they say is, but the neighbors in downtown San Francisco who are welcoming the new people understand that the younger generation of entrepreneurs and tech people value diversity, value diversity, ethnic diversity, value economic diversity, value the arts, and that's where they want to live. And so the communities that have been the most successful, places like Portland, Oregon, places like Brooklyn. My father's from Brooklyn. You should have seen Brooklyn when I was a kid to go see my grandmother in the old days. Now it's the center of the known cultural universe. It's like Haight-Ashbury was in San Francisco in 1967. By the way, it's because people with interesting ideas are coming together in an environment that mixes, not just with other techies, but with the world of fashion, the world of art, the world of media. That's why Brooklyn is happening. But and the vision of this younger generation, at least what they tell me, is not out in the suburbs, not disconnected, not in a house that its only architectural feature that presents to the street is a garage door.
And a garage door opener. One final question before we close this morning. For all of us, going back to our communities, and this came from one of the attendees, we are so energized by this conference, but one or two things we can do when we go back to our communities to bring forward this notion of partnership that will raise the whole community.
I have an idea for you. I mean, I offer it to you humbly because it seems like so many of you are already so far down the road of this. You may not need me to tell you this. But the reason I did this documentary, Lord knows, not to win an Academy Award. It will never make any money either. But it was designed as a convening tool so that people could show it and invite people who might be interested in a coalition to watch it and maybe not copy the ideas from the film, but have a discussion afterwards. I don't think you need to use the film. You can if you like. But you convene a mini version of this conference in the region where you are. Something that's kind of fun and engaging to get the discussion going. Some kind of piece of entertainment. Could be a cultural event or a discussion. And then just set up the event in a way that you understand that when discussion, the headline discussion ends early, so that the real meat of the evening is people exchanging business cards and saying, what are we going to do now? We're here, we're local, we don't need the internet to get us together, we're next to each other right now. I think that's when we've seen places that haven't had these projects already going have been able to jumpstart these projects. In my town in northern New Jersey, they saw this and they said, well, we'd like a time bank. And it's actually not that hard to set up. I'm not suggesting you need to, but it's the one thing about a time bank is that you can start seeing small benefits in a few weeks. People can start swapping the favors. The beauty of the time bank is when you're sitting there doing the favor, when you're doing the hours worth of whatever it is you're doing, you're talking, and you're probably talking about a community issue. And so it can be an interesting, it can have a political power, people sort of starting to kind of get together to talk about issues. So that would be what I would say is it's not hard to do the home version of this conference in a local community, because that group that shows up, the one we did in New Jersey on Sunday was the only nice warm day in 3 months. It was 54 suddenly for a second. And we still got a bunch of people in a room wanting to talk about these issues. And then they stayed, and then they talked, and then they're going to meet again when I'm long gone. So that's my advice.
David Brancaccio, thank you for your words, for your commentary. Wonderful. Thank you.